That was the third time she had heard those words. Not from three different people, from the same woman at the triage desk, delivered each time with the same mild, practiced inflection of someone who has learned to say a thing without meaning it. The first time had been 45 minutes ago, the second time had been 22 minutes ago, the third time was now, and the woman in the waiting room chair who had received this assurance 3 times was 71 years old, sitting with both feet flat on the floor, her coat folded neatly in her lap because there was no hook and she did not want to put it on the chair beside her in case someone needed to sit down, and she was in pain. She had not announced that she was in pain, she had not made a scene. She had told the triage nurse when she first arrived that she was having chest tightness and difficulty breathing that had begun approximately 90 minutes before she came in, and the triage nurse had given her a paper form to fill out and directed her to a seat. That had been 2 hours ago. 2 hours. Around her, the emergency room moved in its particular managed chaos. Call lights, rolling carts, the electronic double doors opening and closing at unpredictable intervals, the fluorescent overhead light that buzzed at a frequency nobody else seemed to notice but which she had been listening to for 2 hours. She was not invisible. Nurses and orderlies and a physician in scrubs with a tablet had walked past her multiple times. One orderly had made direct eye contact and kept moving. The physician had not looked up from his tablet. She sat with her coat in her lap. She breathed carefully. She did not make a sound. What she wore around her neck on a lanyard that had been under the collar of her blouse since she had put it on that morning out of pure habit, the way you put on a watch, the way you put on your glasses, was a badge. A small laminated badge, rectangular, blue trim, institutional seal in the upper left corner. It was face down against her chest. It had been there for 43 years. She had never once used it to get faster service in an emergency room. She had never once worn it for any reason other than that it was a workday, and the badge went with the workday, the same as shoes and keys and the small notebook in her coat pocket. Nobody had asked. Nobody had looked. In approximately 8 minutes, a charge nurse named Adrienne Cole would come through the electronic double doors from the treatment area, carrying a clipboard, scanning the waiting room for someone who had been flagged to her twice by 2 separate nurses, and once by the triage desk and who had still not been called. Adrienne Cole would locate the woman. She would crouch down to be at eye level. She would reach out to take the pulse from her wrist as a preliminary assessment, and in doing so, she would cause the lanyard to shift and the badge to flip and the seal to face outward, and she would read 3 lines of text that would cause her to stand up very quickly and say, in a voice calibrated for the situation, "I need a room, right now." But that was 8 minutes away. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Grace Marsh. She was 71 years old. She had been a physician for 43 years. Have you ever been made to wait for something that should not have required waiting, while the urgency you couldn't stop feeling was invisible to everyone around you? Let me take you back 48 years. Evelyn Grace had grown up in a town in rural Tennessee that was, when she was born, operating under the last of the formal structures of racial segregation and the informal structures that outlasted them by decades. Her father was a farmer and a deacon. Her mother was the only black teacher at the elementary school in the adjacent county, which had integrated in name 3 years before Evelyn started school and in practice by approximately the time she finished it. They were not a wealthy family by any standard that used the word conventionally. They were wealthy in the specific way that families are wealthy when both parents are educated and love their children with disciplined and active devotion and have decided, with the clarity of people who have seen what happens to people without options, that their children will have options. Evelyn had been taken to see a doctor once as a child, when she was 7, and had a fever that had lasted 4 days and showed no intention of stopping. The doctor was the only physician in a 30-mile radius. He was white. He was not unkind, but there was something in the transaction, in the quality of the examination, the duration of it, the economy of his explanations to her mother, that Evelyn registered even at 7 with the accuracy of children who are learning to read rooms. Her mother had asked a specific question about the medication. The doctor had handed her the prescription form and moved to the door. He had not answered the question. Her mother had answered the question herself, at home, from a medical reference book she owned, a thick gray book with a cracked spine that lived on the bottom shelf of the living room bookcase, and which Evelyn had already, at 7, spent considerable time with for reasons she could not have entirely articulated at that age, but which had something to do with the fact that the book answered questions in the same patient, precise way her mother answered questions, without suggesting that some questions weren't worth asking. She had read that book from cover to cover twice before she started high school. She had graduated at the top of her class. She had received a scholarship to a historically black college 3 states away. which her father drove her to in the family's second-hand Buick, loading the trunk himself the night before, with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that what he is doing is important and wants his body to know it. She had studied pre-medicine. She had applied to medical school and been rejected twice. Once with a letter that said her application was competitive but the program was very selective, and once with no letter at all, simply a silence that eventually became undeniable. She had applied a third time. She had been accepted. She had specialized in internal medicine with a focus on cardiovascular disease. She had chosen cardiovascular disease because it was the field that most directly killed the people she had come from. The farmers and deacons and rural teachers and their children, the people in communities that had insufficient access to the kind of preventive care that catches the problems before they become the problems that bring you to an emergency room at 9:30 in the morning with chest tightness and difficulty breathing. She had spent 21 years in clinical practice before transitioning, at 52, into academic medicine and medical administration. She was, at the time she sat in that waiting room, the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and a senior professor of medicine at one of the larger teaching hospitals in the state. The teaching hospital, in fact, that ran the emergency room she was sitting in. She knew the attending physician rotation. She knew most of the nursing staff by name. She had, 6 months before this morning, chaired the hospital's Equity and Inclusion Committee that had produced a 60-page report on documented racial disparities in emergency care wait times, triage prioritization, and pain assessment. The report had been presented to the hospital's board of directors. It had been acknowledged. A working group had been formed to review recommendations. The working group was ongoing. She was sitting in the emergency room of her own hospital 2 hours into a cardiac event, and no one had come to assess her. This was not an accident. This was the report, lived. The cardiac symptoms she was experiencing, the chest tightness, the difficulty breathing, the fatigue that had been building for 3 days but that she had attributed to a particularly demanding week, were consistent with what she had written about, lectured about, and published about for 20 years. She knew what they were. She had known when she first felt them at 7 that morning in her kitchen, drinking the first cup of coffee she had not been able to finish in 30 years of early mornings, feeling the weight across her sternum that was not anxiety and not indigestion and not the kind of thing you explain away when you have spent 4 decades understanding the cardiovascular system from the inside out. She had driven herself to the hospital, not because she didn't have people who could have driven her. She had colleagues. She had a son who lived 40 minutes away. She had a neighbor who had offered to help with anything, anytime since Evelyn's husband died 4 years ago. She had driven herself because she had looked at the clock and looked at the quality of what she was feeling and made a calculation that 45 minutes of waiting for someone to come was 45 minutes she didn't want to spend. She had arrived at 9:14. It was now 11:19. The physician with the tablet had passed her twice. She had watched him. He was young, mid-30s, the specific blend of competence and confidence and selective attention that she had seen in residence for 40 years and had spent considerable effort trying to refine. She had published a paper on it, the correlation between implicit bias in pain assessment and racially disparate triage outcomes in high-volume emergency settings. It had been peer-reviewed and cited extensively in the Equity Committee report. She had the abstract memorized. She was looking at the abstract, in person, from a waiting room chair. What she didn't know, what she had not anticipated when she chose this particular morning to have a cardiac event in her own emergency room, was that Adrienne Cole had been looking for her. Adrienne Cole had been the charge nurse in this ER for 9 years. She had read the Equity Committee report. She had not just read it, she had been one of 4 clinical staff interviewed for it, had provided the specific data on triage timing patterns that had formed the evidentiary core of the section on racial disparities in wait times. She had given those numbers to the committee with the specific professional clarity of someone who has been watching something happen for years and finally has a formal mechanism for saying, here it is in numbers, do something about it. She had been told, 2 hours earlier, by a nurse who recognized the symptom profile of the woman waiting in seat 14, that someone needed to look at this patient. She had flagged it to the attending. She had flagged it to the triage supervisor. She had been told both times that the patient had been triaged and was in the queue. She had come through the electronic double doors herself. She crossed the waiting room to seat 14. She crouched. She said, "I'm sorry you've been waiting. Can I take your pulse?" She reached for the woman's wrist. The lanyard shifted. The badge turned over. Adrienne Cole read it. She stood up. "I need a room," she said to the orderly behind her. "Right now." Dr. Evelyn Marsh was in a treatment room within 90 seconds. She was connected to a cardiac monitor within 4 minutes. The EKG confirmed what she had known since 7 that morning. The attending physician, the young man with the tablet, came into the room quickly with an expression that moved through several stages in the first 10 seconds: recognition of the badge, recognition of the name on the badge, recognition of what the name on the badge meant in this institution, and then the specific, complicated expression of a man who is trying to be a good physician and understanding in real time that the good physician he wants to be and the physician he had been for the last 2 hours are not the same person. He treated her. He was thorough. He was good at his job. None of that was the question. She was admitted. The cardiac event was confirmed as what she had known it was, a significant but non-fatal myocardial event, the kind that, treated promptly, carries an excellent prognosis, the kind that, not treated promptly, does not. She had waited 2 hours. She spent 4 days in the hospital. She was discharged on a Thursday morning with a treatment plan, a prescription, and the specific uncluttered clarity that serious illness sometimes produces, the clarity of having looked at something clearly and decided what to do about it. She did not file a personal complaint. What she did was more direct. The day after she was discharged, she requested a meeting with the hospital's chief medical officer, the director of emergency services, and the chair of the board of directors. The meeting was granted within 48 hours because she was the associate dean for faculty affairs and because the people granting the meeting already knew, or suspected, what the meeting was going to be about. She walked into that meeting with the Equity Committee report under her arm and a document she had written the night before in her kitchen at the same table where she had sat with the cup of coffee she couldn't finish on the morning of the cardiac event. The document was 6 pages. It was not an appeal for sympathy. It was a clinical analysis, precisely worded, methodologically rigorous, citing specific incidents including, and not limited to, the 2 hours she had spent in seat 14. That made a single argument. The findings of the Equity Committee report were not projections or hypothetical risks. They were current, documented, and had now resulted in a senior physician and faculty member experiencing a potentially life-threatening delay in care in this institution's own emergency department. The document proposed a set of specific, measurable interventions. It included a timeline. It included accountability metrics. It included a mechanism for ongoing monitoring. It was the kind of document produced by someone who has spent 43 years understanding that the difference between a problem being acknowledged and a problem being solved is the specificity of what you ask for when you ask. The chief medical officer read the first 3 pages in the meeting and put the document down. She looked at Evelyn. She said, "What do you need from us to make this happen?" Evelyn told her. The emergency department's triage protocols were revised within 30 days. The revision included symptom-specific fast-track criteria that decoupled initial assessment timing from the Q system for patients presenting with cardiac symptoms, regardless of demographic presentation. The revision was implemented alongside a mandatory training module on implicit bias in pain and symptom assessment that was required for all clinical staff with emergency department duties. The training module was developed by a team that Adrienne Cole helped lead. She had been asked personally by Evelyn. She had said yes immediately, the way people say yes when they have been waiting a long time to be asked the right question. The attending physician who had walked past Evelyn's chair twice wrote her a letter. It was not required. He was not asked to write it. It was 2 pages. Handwritten, and it said specific things about what he had understood in that treatment room and what he intended to do differently and what he was asking himself about the physician he was still in the process of becoming. She read it at her kitchen table with the kind of attention she gave to everything that deserved it. She kept it. 3 months after Evelyn's discharge, the hospital published an updated equity report. The working group's findings, informed by the triage protocol revision and the new training data. The cover page listed the Equity Committee's membership. Her name was at the top as committee chair. The gray book with the cracked spine, her mother's medical reference, the one from the bottom shelf of the living room bookcase, was in Evelyn's home office, still on a shelf, still holding a bookmark her mother had placed in it in 1961, a flat card with a verse from Proverbs on one side and her mother's name in pencil on the other. Evelyn had not moved the bookmark in 40 years. She did not intend to. She returned to work 6 weeks after her discharge. She walked back through the emergency department on her first day. Adrienne Cole was at the nursing station. She looked up. "How are you feeling?" Adrienne asked. "Better," Evelyn said. "How are the wait times looking?" Adrienne smiled. She looked at the board. She said, "Better." The fluorescent light in the waiting room had been replaced. It no longer buzzed. That was the thing Evelyn noticed first. Not the new triage signage, not the updated workstation configuration, not the training module certificates on the staff board. The light. It didn't buzz. Someone had finally replaced it. She stood in the waiting room doorway for a moment and listened to the silence where the buzz had been. Then she went to work. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or something you've seen, or something you felt in a waiting room or a hallway where you should not have had to wait, hit like, share this, subscribe, and ring the bell. And tell me in the comments, have you or someone you love been made to wait for care that should not have required waiting? What happened and what do you wish had been different? Here's what really gets me. It's not the badge, it's the coat folded in her lap because she didn't want to take up the chair beside her in case someone needed to sit down. 71 years old, having a cardiac event, waiting 2 hours in her own hospital, and she was thinking about whether someone else might need the seat. That is who she was. That is who she had always been. The woman who got up at 5 a.m. to read the book that answered questions the doctor hadn't stayed to answer. The woman who applied to medical school 3 times. The woman who wrote the 60-page report and chaired the working group and then walked into that meeting with the follow-up document and said, "Here is what I need you to do," specifically with a timeline and accountability metrics. She did not wait for someone to recognize her. She worked, she documented, she asked for what was specific and measurable. She noticed when the light stopped buzzing. What's your version of the gray book on the bottom shelf? The thing you taught yourself because no one thought to teach you? Tell me below.